The time is upon us in our space explorations class, so we're going to begin exploring space. We had a nice interlude with flight and rocketry to get a better appreciation of what it took to get us into space. The space exploration timeline usually begins with something known as the Cold War. And this is where I used to start, as I mentioned many times before, in space explorations class, till I realized many of us didn't have a full grasp of how difficult it was just to get off the ground as humans, as we tend to be able to take it for granted these days. So the Cold War, typically where we start with looking at how humans got into space. The Cold War was post-World War II. When the collapse of World War II, or the end of World War II happened, we did the old divvy up the spoils of war. And things are compartmentalized. So Germany all of a sudden was now West Germany, East Germany. Even the capital city within Germany was split into West Berlin, East Berlin. And depending on where your nationalism rested, it was us and them. Maybe us was literally us, U.S., United States, versus the countries that were associated with usually communism as a form of government versus the democratic. The them, from the U.S. perspective, was the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic. This is what's on your page 3, and you don't need to print this off. This is just for reference here. The USSR we have up here, once the Cold War ended, I know we just brought it up and it's already come to an end, ended late 1990, 1991. This right here was the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic. That's what the USSR is an initialism for. And then post the Cold War, these are the independent countries that came out of the USSR. The us versus them, perhaps you are on the side of that this is us and the USA was them. You know, there's always two sides to everything. So back during USSR times, this was all USSR. The biggest republic within, or the union within the republic, was Russia, and oftentimes people will say the Cold War was the US versus Russia, when really Russia was just the largest landmass. That would be like saying Alaska represented all of the United States of America. Alaska is just one state within the United States. So here is the USSR in this outline of red, and here it's the same map, but now I'm not showing you this outline or border of the former USSR, showing more of the independent states, things like Estonia, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, Belarus. And the Cold War is called the Cold War in the sense that there weren't battlefields. So you can go to places in the United States where great battles of the Civil War occurred, and there are even groups of people that will do reenactments of various battles of things from Revolutionary War, Civil War. But there's really not so much anything about a Cold War reenactment, in that there wasn't any particular place on the globe where here is this battle within the Cold War. The Cold War really was what I call the nanny nanny boo boo war. It was a war of, I have more nuclear weapons than you do. My nuclear weapons can kill more people than yours, so I need to build bigger nuclear weapons. It's the whole nanny nanny boo boo. I have more and mine are more powerful. And really it was about this living on the edge of, okay, is that red button going to actually be pressed that could destroy a large portion of our planet? Hence this comic here, the Cold War reenactment. It's who's going to press that infamous red button. Here's another Cold War reenactment. Those of us that went to school during the Cold War, this is the drills that we would have. And we did sit under the desk thinking to ourselves, how is this going to protect me from a nuclear detonation? But it's the drill, it's what you do. It's the tradition to find the gum under the seats in your earthquake drills now, so it lives on. As I said, it's the nanny nanny-boo-boo war. Why does Russia want more missiles? Really should say Soviet Union, but because we have more. Why do we have more? Because they had more. Why didn't we both get started on less instead of more? It's a great and wonderful thing in hindsight, but if we go back to the era of 1945, when the era of nuclear war or nuclear threat of war began, of course this is after the end of World War II with the atomic bombs being dropped on Hiroshima in Japan. This animated map shows every nuclear bomb explosion in history. And I just want you to think about, yes, the United States, unfortunately, has the historical moment of dropping the first atomic bomb on our planet. We have some other countries here, Soviet Union on the other extreme, People's Republic of China, might recognize the United Kingdom, this is India, France. Just imagine from 1945 to, I think the graphic goes to 2009, how many more or any more nuclear bombs have been exploded from the time of 1945. Just mentally think, how many nuclear bombs? Yeah, it's insane. So I'm not sure it's a great thing to be the leader of, that we have exploded 1,127 nuclear capable bombs, and the former Soviet Union 976, and France 210, United Kingdom 46. So crazy. Here's another animation, or this infographic to show you the last 10 years included, and well, we're still in the lead, as you'll see, the United States. Just insane. Alright, so the Cold War is really what started this whole we're better than you, technological wise as well. The year of 1957 was the International Geophysical Year, a time of great celebration and concentration on recognizing the contributions of this particular field of science. And I'm going to show you a clip of the president at the time in 1957 in the United States announcing one of the most significant events they were going to have in play for celebrating the International Geophysical Year.
July 1st marks the beginning of one of the great scientific adventures of our time, the International Geophysical Year. During this period, which will actually be 18 months long, the scientists of the United States will join their efforts with those of the scientists of some 60 other nations to make the most intensive study ever undertaken of our planet. The scientists tell us that they cannot possibly anticipate all of the valuable scientific knowledge that will result from their efforts. They believe that many of the facts thus acquired will give us new understanding and new power over the forces of nature. As I see it, however, the most important result of the International Geophysical Year is the demonstration of the ability of peoples of all nations to work together harmoniously for the common good. I hope this can become common practice in other fields of human endeavor. The United States is proud to have a part in this great scientific undertaking.
So General Eisenhower outlined the excitement that was anticipated for the celebration of the International Geophysical Year going from 1957 through the full year up to 1958. All right, this will take us to October Sky. Now, not the movie, my friends, but the information associated with a very famous moment in October. Probably the most significant moment in all of humanity, if you were to ask me. Other people might mention things like the printing press had the largest significant impact on humanity. I have to agree, that's a pretty good choice. Others might say internet, a huge shift and change in humanity. I have to agree there. I just go with Sputnik because this space exploration is my ultimate passion in life. And so for me, one of the greatest accomplishments that really changed the way in which the world operates and functions is absolutely this day, the 4th of October, 1957. So that's a day that you actually need to have the full date in your notes. So the name Sputnik, which is Cyrillic Russian for spacecraft, spacecraft 1 in English. And it was launched the 4th of October 1957, and life on the planet Earth has never really been the same since. Now, in 1957, we are really into this Cold War, that it's us and them, and the U.S. is not friends with the Soviet Union, and vice versa. We don't share our scientific data. We don't work in this collaborative nature that President Eisenhower was really hoping for and advocating in that clip you just saw. And Sputnik was perceived very differently on the United States soil than it was in the USSR. For the USSR, it was a great victory. What Sputnik was the world's first artificial satellite. The world's first artificial satellite. Now, natural satellite, of course, being the moon, but the first man-made object to leave planet Earth and travel to space and orbit our planet, orbit making a lap around the planet. It was a cause of celebration in the Soviet Union. Great victory, great success, an enormous engineering feat. In the U.S., though, is perceived very differently. Cold War, we didn't know what this was. Was this a bomb? Was this a spy satellite that had camera, that they could see what we were doing, that they could find our nuclear weapon armories, they could find our launch sites? It was a very terrifying thing for the United States folks in 1957. The headline that is often associated with Sputnik 1 is the beep heard round the world, because the Soviets made no bones about letting the whole world know about their accomplishment. And this is some audio footage from 1957 of the satellite Sputnik sending its data back to planet Earth. You and I would listen to this and go, that's nice, beep, beep, very good. This sound to anyone who is alive in 1957 will actually still send prickles along the hair on the back of their necks and their arms. One of my favorite things to do every year is in the summer is to teach teachers the world of astronomy, or working on their astronomy endorsements. And oftentimes I have older teachers in the class, and when I mention Sputnik, they'll come up to me after the day's lesson and talk about how, yeah, you are right, it really was a terrifying time, and how replaying that audio that I'm about to play for you of the beeps really does cause a little prickle up the back of their necks. Again, you and I, because I wasn't around in 1957 either, thank you very much, we just listened to this and go, nice beeps. But it was terrifying to the American citizens in 1957 because they didn't know what this thing was. They just knew the Soviets had put some sort of mechanical device in orbit around the planet. So here are the beeps heard around the world that changed civilization. We now know that the data that was being sent was atmospheric data. This is a scientific probe to but to determine and collect data on what is it like out there beyond Earth's atmosphere. And we, of course, didn't know that at the time. We, meaning the United States citizens, we didn't know about that. And it's about the size of a basketball. Here is the Sputnik being encapsulated, kind of like an extended view. The 50th anniversary of the launch of Sputnik that launched the world of space exploration in many people's minds, historian minds. Google Doodle in honor of that. Here is on display in the U.S. Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., the plans for the Sputnik. And museums are great models for being able to demonstrate ability to work and collaborate together, as these are the actual Soviet Union documents that are on loan to the United States. The only thing that remains left of Sputnik is the Sputnik key. And it's a very blurry photo, which means I took the photo. And the key is not like turn ignition, start the engine type of a key. It's more of, if you think about a toy, an electronic that you might buy in a store, and it has a little plastic tab that you need to pull so that the batteries are engaged in a circuit, and those little plastic tabs are in there to preserve the life of the batteries. That's kind of essentially what this thing was. Pull this out, you get the circuitry running. So, magnificent remnant. It speaks to the way in which space exploration has changed human civilization. So on our log for the accomplishments of space exploration, we definitely are going to have that the first human-made object, artificial satellite in orbit, check, ching ching, that is going to go to the Soviet Union. One thing that affects your life directly with the result of the launch of Sputnik is if you have ever visited a school counselor. After the launch of Sputnik and how it really terrorized folks across the U.S., the students at the time would go home, and this was a time in the United States when people would sit and eat and have dinner together, and they would hear the frustrations, the fear, and the anger from their parents. They would go to school. Their friends would be talking about the angst of their parents. And so it was decided that school counselors should be brought into our schools to help alleviate some of this tension, some of this anxiety. And the school counselors have been around ever since. And you must thank your counselor for helping them get you to survive your schooling experience and your astronomy class with me. Sputnik 2. Sputnik 2. This is the launch of the first animal in space. This was in 1957, November as well. You don't need to have the date here. You do want to have that Sputnik 2 is the launch of Lika. Lika, she was the first creature in space. She was trained to press different levers that would dispense food for her. There was water. 1957 is a time period that's very different than the 21st century now that we're living in, where we are much more conscientious as a human race of how we treat our fellow animals. In the 50s, 60s, 70s, in that time period of scientific research, animals didn't have quite the protection that they do have now. It's very harsh to even consider the thought that these early animals were never intended to travel and return safely to planet Earth. This was the very beginning of putting things into space, and the ability to recover spacecraft wasn't quite where it needed to be. Lika was destined to be in orbit for about 10 days. Unfortunately, something with the air system to deliver oxygen to her failed, and she unfortunately passed away 3 days into her experience into space. Not because she was in space, but because some faultiness in the mechanism of the Sputnik 2 spacecraft. So the first mammal in space is also to the Soviets. So we have these footage or these images coming to the United States from the Soviet Union, really showing their prowess technologically wise. They put the first thing into orbit. They have the first mammal in orbit. It's quite unsettling to the folks in the United States. So there's Lika. Lika is very highly revered by the former republics of the Soviet Union, and still today held in high regard for being the first mammal in space. So these are postage stamps in honor of Lika from the various Soviet Union republics at the time. In now Russia is a monument for Lika, the first mammal in space. Rover, if you could meet a famous dog in history, like Lassie, Rin Tin Tin, or Bandit from Johnny Quest, who would it be? Easy, Lika, the dog the Russians put into space. That might be a hair difficult. You see, Rover, Lika's no longer on this planet. Well, duh. So the U.S. needs to respond to this sheer space domination here in the early days by the Soviet Union. So on 6th of December 57, the U.S. launches a little bit earlier than they had intended the satellite Vanguard. So this is going to be our response to the Soviet Sputnik. It wasn't this quick, oh, hurry up and build a satellite in response to Sputnik. The Vanguard was a project that had been in operation for many, many, many months, but the launch date was moved a little bit forward. Here's the image right here, and anytime you see black at launch time, that's generally not good, as you'll see here.
A 6-inch moon that was to have been America's first Earth satellite, and a Vanguard rocket that was to have sent it on its globe-circling career from Cape Canaveral in Florida. A moment or two of high expectation after the firing button has been pressed. Is that a fuel leak there in the first section of the 3-stage rocket? Disaster follows, as this official film shows only too clearly. Fire followed the explosion. The launching of an American moon had still to be accomplished. A big setback indeed, but probably more so in the realm of prestige and propaganda than in any other way.
That propaganda really is at the heart of the Cold War. We can do things better than you, we have more of this. So that was a very damaging blow to the United States. If you have seen the movie October Sky, which documents one individual's desire to build rockets and travel into space themselves perhaps, the rocket they see on their television is the Vanguard rocket as the character, not a character, it's an actual story, based on the actual story of Homer Hickam as he writes to Werner von Braun saying that he's sorry for his setbacks. So the name October Sky for the film is just absolutely so fitting because it all began with this launch of the Sputnik in October 1957.
This is The Big Picture,
All right.
an official television
How about
report
Vanguard
of the United
2?
States Army, produced for the armed forces and the American people.
The date, the morning of November 8, 1957, at Huntsville, Alabama. A sudden meeting has been called by General John B. Medeiros, Commanding General of the Army Ballistic Missile Agency.
Good morning, gentlemen. Be seated, please. I have a very important announcement for you. We've been assigned the mission of launching a scientific Earth satellite. And we will use the Jupiter C configuration as a carrier that we developed along with the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. I promised the Secretary of the Army that we would be ready in 90 days or less. Let's go, Werner.
This is what they've been waiting for. The deadline is 90 days. 90 days to put a satellite into orbit. A crash program, an emergency. And the American people had become aware of that emergency long before, when a Soviet Sputnik beeped its way across the skies. The reaction was one of astonishment and concern, for it was now known that a potential enemy was at least temporarily ahead in developing means for space travel. Reaction, counter-reaction. ABMA was a crack team headed by old pros of the missile field. Dr. Werner von Braun, director of the Development Operations Division, supervised over 3,000 scientists, engineers, and technicians with more years of practical experience than any similar group elsewhere. The decision was passed down. Modify the Redstone ballistic missile, the Army's most powerful weapons carrier over a 200-mile range. Why the Redstone? It had proved itself again and again on the ABMA launching pads at Cape Canaveral, Florida. But meanwhile, far across the country at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, a sprawling 80-acre research and development complex in Pasadena, California, scientists and engineers were racing toward the same deadline: 90 days to put a satellite into orbit. Their job, furnish the high-speed upper stages to take over after the first stage powered the satellite to the prescribed distance from the Earth. As is so often said in the Army, but rarely with more accuracy, this was it. Minutes click past relentlessly. The beams of powerful searchlights light up the missile, truly the star of one of the greatest suspense dramas of our time. The drama approaches the final act, the Army's first attempt to fire a man-made moon into orbit. Time, late evening, Friday, January 31st, 1958, in a blockhouse at Canaveral. The countdown to Explorer 1.
Roger. Okay, we'll start now. 15 seconds. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Firing command. Firing command. Firing command.
The missile is in flight, but the success of its mission is still in doubt. It will take another hour and a half to know whether the satellite is in orbit, the most tense and harrowing wait of all. About midnight, not far from the now empty launching pad, General Medeiros finally called his assistant, Colonel Leonard Orman.
Hello, Len. You can send this off to the secretary, that our satellite is definitely on orbit. Now get that off, and then I'll give you the figures in a few minutes. Okay, boy.
20 minutes later, Dr. Porter opened the question and answer session by introducing three of the key men in the success story of Explorer 1.
The question is, has any form of life been placed in the satellite? I think I could answer that one almost myself. Not intentionally.
Maybe we have a Florida cockroach inside, we don't know.
Everybody welcomed the touches of humor, for it was, after all, an hour of jubilation. Just one more, came the inevitable plea from the photographers, and exhausted as they were, the trio obliged, with what was to be the page one spread in newspapers all over the world. In plain language, the United States was in the space business along with the Russians, and Explorer 1 was the beginning.
Not Vanguard 2. U.S. switched it up a bit here. They set aside the Vanguard project temporarily and went to von Braun and went with the Explorer 1 spacecraft. So in the Explorer 1 space here, we want to note that this is the U.S.'s first satellite, first artificial satellite for the United States. You don't have to have the date, just that the Explorer 1 is the U.S.'s first artificial satellite. And then that picture headlined the news. This gentleman right here is Dr. Van Allen, as of the fame of the Van Allen belts that were discovered through the use of these magnetic sensors on the Explorer, the Van Allen radiation belts of the Earth. All right, that Vanguard 2, what do we think of Vanguard 2? They got it down? Let's see.
The Navy primes a 20-inch satellite for flight, hoping it'll join Uncle Sam's 3 baby moons now circling the Earth. The latest is instrumented to collect data on the X-ray output of the sun and meteoric particles encountered in space, where intense radiation has been detected by our satellites. Riding in the nose of the 3rd stage of the Vanguard rocket, the newest satellite depends upon myriad electrical components to get it into orbit. Searchlights pierce the night at Cape Canaveral, as from the launching pad, Vanguard, a 3-stage rocket, pursues its mission of the International Geophysical Year, a giant torch reaching for distance. But, and to men who sweat out these projects a mighty important but, orbit is not attained. The first 2 stages successful. The rocket's 3rd stage does not fire and falls into the sea. Telemetered records inform the Navy that failure of a small component or a wire tripped the Vanguard.
Oh dear. That's most unfortunate. What will the 3rd attempt of a Vanguard launch yield? What do you think? Follow the expression, 3rd time's a charm? We'll see.